We've taken a look at Luke chapter 8 and the first half of this chapter so far in our studies. And one of the things that we pointed out in that first half of the chapter was the parable of the sower. The parable of the sower is a lesson about how we hear the word of God and how we respond to God. And what we're going to notice as we continue through Luke chapter 8 is we have several examples given to us as to how people responded to the word of God and to God himself. There are actually, when we look at Luke chapter 8, 4 encounters with Jesus that Luke presents to us in the back half of chapter 8 of his gospel. And we could break down these encounters week by week and sermon by sermon and detail by detail, and I thought about doing that. But in today's lesson, what I instead want to do is I want to take a bird's eye view of these scenes and take a look at all of these encounters in one gulp, so that we might be impressed with the various angles at which Jesus is able to tackle each difficulty that he is called to face in this section. And by doing so, it's my hope that we leave here today confident of one basic fact, and that is our problems are no match for the power of Jesus. And so I want to begin by reading this lengthy text in Luke chapter 8. We're going to start in verse 22, and we're just going to gather together some simple points here today about the problems presented to Jesus in the text and how he is able to powerfully conquer them. Now, as we read, I want to really encourage you to zone in. I want to encourage you to focus, because I know that sometimes when we have a lengthy reading like this, our temptation is to lose focus. But I want to tell you today that what I'm about to read to you is the most important thing that I'm going to say. A lot of times we get that backwards. We think the most important thing that the preacher says is what the preacher says about the text. The most important thing that I say is the text. It comes directly from God. That's the most important thing. Everything else after that is what I think about the text and try to share with you. And I hope that that is accurate and encouraging as well. But let's make sure that we don't zone out of the text itself. So let's read the text and think about what it says to us. Notice beginning in verse 22. It says, "One day he got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, 'Let us go across to the other side of the lake.' So they set out, and as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water, and they were in danger. And they went and they woke him, saying, 'Master, Master, we are perishing.' And he awoke, and he rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was a calm. He said to them, 'Where is your faith?' And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, 'Who then is this, that he commands even winds and water, and they obey him?'" Second scene that we have begins in verse 26. Verse 26, scene 2 of what we're going to look at today. It says, "Then they sailed to the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. And when Jesus had stepped out on land, there met him a man from the city who had demons. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he had not lived in a house, but among the tombs. And when he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him and said with a loud voice, 'What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me.' For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many a time it had seized him. He was kept under guard, and he was bound with chains and shackles. But he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the desert. Jesus then asked him, 'What is your name?' And he said, 'Legion,' for many demons had entered him. And they begged him not to command them to depart into the abyss. Now, a large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him to let them enter these. And so Jesus gave them permission. And then the demons came out of the man and entered the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and drowned. Now when the herdsmen saw what had happened, they fled, and they told it in the city and in the country. And then people went out to see what had happened. And they came to Jesus and found the man from whom the demons had gone sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it told them how the demon-possessed man had been healed. And then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. So Jesus got into the boat and returned, and the man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." And he went away, proclaiming throughout the whole city how much Jesus had done for him. The third scene is a scene that we skip a couple of verses, starting in verse 43. It's kind of a scene within a scene. And this third scene is here. Verse 43 begins with this. There was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years. And though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. And Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" And when all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowd surround you and they're pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me." And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling, falling down before Jesus, and declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." And then the fourth scene, which starts in verse 40 but picks back up in verse 49, it says this. Now when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And by the way, this is quite a different scene. The people who were in the country of the Gerasenes sent him away. They wanted him to leave. But when he got back to the other side of the lake, the people wanted him to come. The crowd welcomed him. They were all waiting. And there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue. And falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. And while he was still speaking, someone from the ruler's house came and said, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher anymore." But Jesus, on hearing this, answered him, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be well." And when he came to the house, he allowed no one to enter with him, except Peter and John and James and the father and mother of the child. And all were weeping and mourning for her. But he said, "Do not weep, for she is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But taking her by the hand, he called, saying, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned, and she got up at once. And he directed that something should be given her to eat. And her parents were amazed, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened. All right. Now, as we think about these four different scenes, I just want to cover three major topics with you. And as we think about this text, I want to first focus on the variety of problems that Jesus encounters. Because sometimes we're tempted to think, oh, Jesus wouldn't really understand me, my difficulty, my problem. I've got a unique problem. I want you to be impressed with the variety of problems that Jesus addresses within this text and that he conquers. And one of the first problems that we see Jesus conquering is the problem of panic. Jesus encounters the problem of panic. All right, the disciples in Luke 8:22-25, they decide to cross the lake. Oftentimes they were doing this to get away from the crowds. The crowds were pressing on Jesus, and he would get into the boat, worn out, exhausted. They would try to get to the other side so they could find a little rest. And as they're quietly going about their business, a windstorm creates a dangerous situation on the waters. Now, the Sea of Galilee is on some sides, it is surrounded by mountainous areas. And so the winds, instead of going across the sea like it would on a flat terrain, the winds actually start to shift downwards, which makes the waves extremely choppy. And this is the scene here. The waves are getting extremely choppy, and the water, because it's choppy, is starting to get into the boat, and the disciples are beginning to panic. It's a dangerous situation. And as they're in a panic, Jesus is sound asleep, and so they wake him up. He's the only person that they can think of that might be able to handle this problem or give them some type of hope in the situation. And it says in verse 24 that he arose, he rebuked the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and there was a calm. And he says to them, "Where's your faith?" It's amazing as we think about this text and the situations that we get into when we are neck deep in problems. Sometimes we forget who is in the boat with us to help us through stormy waters. And let's not forget, when we're in situations, trials, where we begin to panic, let's not forget who the one is who can bring the calm. In Luke chapter 8, verses 26 through 40, Jesus encounters another problem, and this is the problem of a wild spirit. That's how I'm going to phrase it, at least. The wild spirit is a man who is such because verse 27 says he'd had demons for a long time. Now, so wild is this man, he's actually described as someone who wore no clothes. He didn't even live in a house. He was living basically in the graveyard, in the cemetery. Now, let's imagine that your boat has just landed and you're looking to start teaching people, and the first person to come up to you is someone who's come out of the graveyard. And he's not just come out of the graveyard, but he's come out of the graveyard and he is naked. He's not wearing anything. Scary situation. This man is wild. And he had scared the people in the town. That's probably why he was living out in the tombs. He wasn't welcome in the town. Now, we could talk about a lot of things when we look at this text. A lot of people like to focus on demon possession, and they talk about demon possession. A lot of people like to ask questions like, well, why did Jesus cast out the demon and send it into the pigs? You learn when you're having a Bible study who the church members are who are members of PETA very quickly when you study this text, because everybody has their protect the pig sign. How could God, the Son of God, had cast out demons and put them into the pigs, and all these pigs go off the shore and all these pigs die? And I have just a really quick answer to that if you feel like you need to segue that way. Then sometimes I have Bible studies, by the way, and some people say, well, I can understand how pigs would be demon possessed. I had a little chihuahua once and he was crazy. I swear he was demon possessed, right? But without getting too far astray, I'll just simply say this. And it's something that Jesus himself said in other texts. And that is, isn't a man of more value than a pig? When people were beginning to wonder why he'd healed a man on the Sabbath day, one of the things that he said in Matthew chapter 12, isn't a man of more value than a sheep? You guys will help a sheep on the Sabbath day. Shouldn't I have helped the man? Isn't this man of more value than a pig? I like animals. I know that many of you do too. But men are more important than animals. Souls are more important than animals. Okay? And so that's all I'm going to talk about with that. But I'll say this about demon possession. The understanding that we have of demon possession, it varies from case to case when we look at the scriptures. But we know in this particular case, it led to a frightening individual in appearance and in behavior. And it caused him to act in a very frightening way. But what we learn about the text is that these demons were no match for the power of Jesus. It says in verse 33, the demons went out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd ran violently down the steep place into the lake and drowned. What do we learn from this? Well, we may think of ourselves as far removed from the days of demon possession, and we think that, well, this sort of thing, this doesn't really happen. But there are some people whose behavior, it is nearly is as erratic and as wild as those of the Gadarene demoniac. There are some truly wild people out there who are living out of control lives, and even the most wild heart can be tamed by Jesus if we'll let him rule our spirits. Third problem that Jesus encounters. He encounters, first of all, the problem of panic. He encounters, second of all, the problem of a wild spirit. But he encounters, thirdly, the problem of disease. In Luke chapter 8, 43 through 48, we have Luke. Now remember who Luke is. Remember what his occupation is. He's a physician. So here we have a physician documenting a medical problem that a woman has had as she comes to Jesus. And he documents it pretty concisely yet graphically. And he says this woman had had a flow of blood for 12 years. The blood never stopped flowing. That, as a Jewish woman, would have made her also ceremonially unclean. But it also would have been quite a nuisance, right? 12 straight years. So frustrated was she by this constant flow of blood that she had spent, verse 43 says, all her livelihood on physicians and could not be healed by any. Perhaps even Luke the physician. I don't know. But Luke seems to know the pretty detailed situation of the case. Now imagine how dreadful her particular disease must have been. So dreadful that she'd nearly basically gone into bankruptcy and drained her accounts trying to solve it. And a lot of people can resonate with medical debt, because sometimes we have medical problems and conditions that are so debilitating and we are trying so desperately to get healed that we will put ourselves into major debt in order to try to help the problem. And sometimes we get the help and sometimes we don't. But her disease was conquered. Verse 44 says that she came from behind, touched the border of his garment, and immediately her flow of blood stopped like that. The problem she had for 12 years at just the touch of Jesus is gone. Now, like this woman, sometimes we're riddled by the problems of physical disease. But Jesus can unravel the most baffling of problems for men today. But there's a fourth problem that Jesus encounters. We could probably look at a few other problems he encounters too, but he encounters a fourth problem in verses 41 and 42 and 49 through 56, and that's the problem of death. Death. And not just the death of anyone, but the death of someone who is a ruler of the synagogue's child. Now, this would have been pretty traumatic to anyone, but imagine you're the ruler of the synagogue. You're considered a very religious and devout person. And a lot of times the Jewish people connected disease and death to a punishment from God for some sort of sin. And so here you are, the ruler of the synagogue, and your child is laying on a bed and about to die. In fact, does die as he's journeying to go get Jesus for help. And so you can imagine how this would have while he's getting his Mother's Day call. You can imagine how that would have affected the ruler of the synagogue. Oh, Vincent over there, you just turned 12 yesterday, right? So this is a little girl the same age as Vincent. And can you imagine how mom and dad would have reacted if little son or daughter is lying on a bed about to die, and how desperately they would have sought for help? Can you imagine that once the child had died, the sadness? I've been around a lot of people who have lost their loved ones in the past 2 decades of preaching, from being in hospitals and in people's houses when hospice was called in and things like that. And a lot of people react very differently. It's interesting. Some people are very quiet, very sober. Some people wail and scream and cry extremely loudly. I don't know what the situation was like here. I know that When someone died in Jewish villages, sometimes there were hired mourners who would actually come immediately when they had heard someone had died, and they would be outside of the house lamenting and mourning in a very loud way and actually playing their instruments. That was just part of the custom of first century. I think actually Jesus is telling some of them to be quiet and get out of the house because he wants some peace and quiet as he heals the girl. But it's hard to know how their parents reacted, but I can tell you this: death can either shake your faith or it can strengthen your faith in the nearness of it. And Jesus simply, verse 54 and 55, takes her by the hand, calls, and says, "Little girl, arise." And her spirit returned, and she arose immediately. Not even death was too great of a foe for Jesus to defeat. Now, if Jesus can even conquer death, as he had already proven through the widow of Nain's son, which we've already studied, then what force can he not overcome? Jesus has encountered panic, a wild spirit, disease, death, and he certainly can help us through our problems as well. What I want you to also notice is that clearly no problem is too great for his power, but have you thought of how his power is a blessing to us and to us emotionally and spiritually? Notice what were the results of his power. Well, first of all, Jesus brings a calm. Knowing that Jesus can help you through your problems and through your difficulties should give us a sense of calm. And that's what we find, first of all, when we look at Luke 8:24, when he calms the sea, there is literally a calm. Whenever you see panic, whenever you feel like you have this dread and fear, whenever you see people in a state of chaos and commotion, and whenever people give you a sense of absolute confusion, always know that Satan is behind that. In James chapter 3, I want you to notice the contrast between the teacher who's teaching good things and helpful things and the false teacher. James chapter 3, the contrast is this, verse 15. It contrasts the fruits of the devil and what the devil will bring to your life and what God will bring to your life. In verse 15, it says, "This wisdom," what wisdom? That's worldly wisdom. The wisdom that's not from God is what he's explaining in verse 15. "This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, it is sensual, and it is demonic." What's going to happen when you're following earthly, sensual, and demonic wisdom? Well, where there's envy and self-seeking that exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. Confusion, chaos, panic, that's coming from Satan. He's bringing that about in your life. But notice the contrast. But the wisdom that is from above, God's wisdom, it is pure and it is peaceable. It gives us peace. When people are trying to help other people, they're not trying to bring chaos to their lives. They're trying to give you a sense of peace if you're really doing God's job. We are peaceable. It brings about gentleness. It makes people willing to yield. It fills us with mercy and good fruits. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. There's a sense of calm that comes about when we do God's work. Satan is the one who stirs storms. Satan is the one who causes division. Satan is the one who gets us arguing and bickering and frustrated with one another. Well, why aren't you doing something? Well, why aren't you doing something? That's what Satan's doing to the disciples in the boat. Jesus, why don't you do something? And Jesus is the one who brings calm. We'll do something. I'm here. Those who are the hands and feet of Jesus are peacemakers then. Blessed are the peacemakers, Jesus says, who help bring us calm after the storms, not the opposite. Jesus, that's one of his great blessings. He brings us calm when we're tempted to panic. Jesus also helps transform. You notice that in verse 35, it says they went out to see what happened. These are the people from the village. They came to Jesus and they found the man from whom the demons had departed sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Now, if you look at that description of the demoniac in contrast to the description of the demoniac when Jesus had first met him, there is a huge change. It's a beautiful contrast to everything that the demoniac was before. He goes from naked, he's wearing clothes now. He goes from chained and then busting out of the chains because he's out of control to now he's self-controlled. He's sitting. He goes from an unsound mind where he's just saying crazy things because he's overcome by the demons, and he has a sound mind. He's willing to listen. He's willing to reason. He's willing to learn from the one who's cleansed him of this demon possession. He goes from being untamed to seated. He goes from unhealthy to healed. He goes from threatening Jesus to proclaiming Jesus. That's what Jesus can do when we come to Jesus. He can transform us. When Satan has control of your life, though, your words are going to be erratic. They're going to be dangerous. It's going to feel like they're a threat to other people. They're going to be out of control. When Satan has control of your life, your deeds are going to be wild. Your behavior is going to be wild. But when we give Jesus control, then we can begin to bear the fruit of the Spirit. And when we bear the fruit of the Spirit, what we start to see is love, joy, peace, long-suffering with others, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It's because Jesus transforms. His powerful grace coupled with our yielding will, it is transformative. Romans chapter 12, Paul says this, and he uses that word transform that we're using here. Paul says this, I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God. God doesn't want to transform your life because he's a killjoy, because he wants to make your life worse. He's doing it out of mercy for you. He doesn't want you to live that wild and erratic and unpredictable lifestyle. By the mercies of God, then present your bodies. Say, Lord, here I am. Send me. I'm here to do your will. Present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. That's your reasonable service. And don't be conformed to this world, because this world is wild and unpredictable and dangerous, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Jesus can transform us, but his will has to be coupled with ours. Jesus also cheers. He cheers. In verse 47, what does he say to the woman who is fearful as she comes before him and in his presence? She says, daughter, be of good cheer. She's afraid Jesus might be upset with her. Yeah, I'm the one that touched you, and you didn't ask me to touch you, and I reached out and I touched you. And he knows that she's afraid and she's trembling, and she says, he's basically saying, I'm not mad at you. Be of good cheer. I'm happy for you. The problem that you've had for so long, it's been solved now. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace. To be in the presence of God always actually brings an initial reaction of fear. You see that all throughout the Bible. When people are in the presence of an angel, when they are in the presence of God himself, there's a sense of fear. But so often the reply of God and his angels, one of the things that God says the most to people when they fear is, do not fear. I don't want you to be afraid. God doesn't want us to be afraid to come into his presence. He calms us. He cheers us. And so we should be thankful that we don't just have a just and a powerful God, but we have a merciful and a forgiving God. He doesn't just want us to fear, but be of good cheer. And it's possible to do so when we realize that he bestows his gifts upon us. Look at another passage, James chapter 4, as we cross-reference this idea. Look at James chapter 4, verses 6 through 10. In verse 6, it says that God gives more grace. He's giving grace to this woman who he helps, and he's giving us grace. And therefore, he says, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Therefore, submit to God. Resist the devil. He will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament, mourn, and weep, but let your laughter be turned to mourning, your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. She humbles herself in the sight of Jesus Christ, and she is lifted up. Jesus cheers. Jesus cheers. Well, one of the last blessings of his power is that he comforts. Comforts. Look at verses 52 through 54. Everyone in that scene is weeping and is mourning for the girl who is dead. And Jesus says, do not weep. We had a sermon a little bit ago about things you can't say to somebody at a funeral. Well, Jesus just said it again, didn't he? Don't weep. Why can he say that? Because he knows what he's about to do. She's not dead, but sleeping. They ridiculed him, knowing that she was dead. But he put them all outside, took her by the hand, and called, saying, "Little girl, arise." So a fourth blessing of Jesus is his assurance and his comfort. Even in the midst of death, Jesus gives assurance to the parents. It's one of the beautiful things about Jesus is that even when we're faced with death, we know that if we're in the Lord, the one who has died and who has risen from the dead, there is still great hope and there is still great comfort. In Psalm 23, this passage is read so often when people are going through a difficult time and so often when people have died. But it's read because it gives us great comfort. It says in verse 4, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." What is it that Jesus does to us in the face and when faced with death? Well, he comforts us. Verse 6 says, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." So Jesus gives us comfort. We are told that when someone who is in Christ has died, one of the things that we're supposed to do to those who mourn is that we're supposed to comfort them. Comfort them with what? With hope and with the assurance that if we are in Jesus Christ, the one who has been raised from the dead, that we have hope. 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 13 says, "I don't want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope." We don't sorrow like them. People who have no hope, that is great, a thing to be sorrowful about. But if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. Those who die in Jesus, they have hope. And so verse 18 says, "Comfort one another with these words." Jesus comforts us when we think of his resurrection power. And so those are some of the blessings of his power, his ability to calm us, to transform us, to cheer us, and to comfort us. And because this is who Jesus is, there's no problem that he cannot overcome. Because of the effects of his power, then there's a certain way in which we should respond to Jesus and everything that he is. Upon the sea, for example, there is a specific response when people realize that Jesus has just calmed a storm and they had no idea how they were going to get out of that situation. And the response of the people is the response of awe and a response of worship. Upon the sea, in verse 25, it says, "Who can this be?" Everything is calm. Everyone's looking around and perhaps they don't see the lightning anymore. The wind has died. The waves are calm. The boat has settled. And as they look around, one of the first things that they think to themselves is, "Who is this who commands the winds and the water and they obey him?" When Jesus saves you from the wrath of the storm and brings calm, then we should have that sense of awe and that sense of worship. Perhaps we struggle to maintain our sense of awe in worship because we failed to realize the great danger we were in before Jesus came to save us. We were all lost, out on the sea. Our lives were a stormy, raging mess, and Jesus saved us and gave us calm. And so our response to him should be a response of, "I want to worship you. I'm amazed by you. You were able to save me from the consequences of my sin." You know, Nolan's preaching tonight, and Nolan's going to be preaching from Ephesians 2 tonight. And so I love Ephesians 2. I'm excited to hear tonight's lesson from Ephesians 2. But I love what it says in verses 1 and 2. "You he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sins." You were dead, but God made you alive. Verse 4, God who is rich in mercy because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead, made us alive together. There should be a sense of, oh, I was dead. I deserved death. And yet Jesus saves me from that. Because of that, my response is I want to worship him. I want to praise him for what he's done. You know, as you look at the demoniac, I want you to think a little bit more about that text. When Jesus transforms your life, it's also natural to want to serve and proclaim him. After the demoniac is healed, verse 35 says, the man from whom the demons had departed, he was sitting at the feet of Jesus. He was clothed in his right mind. He wants to learn from Jesus, but notice verse 38. It says, the man from whom the demons had departed begged him that he might be with him. Okay, he's just been healed by Jesus. He says, Jesus, I want to keep hanging out with you. I was in a mess. You got me out of the mess. I would like to follow you and go with you wherever you go. And Jesus actually says no. Jesus doesn't honor every request that gets made of him. Perhaps Jesus says no for the very reason that he explains here, and that is because the demoniac was going to do a whole lot more good in his hometown than he was going to do in all these other cities. Why? Because people in the hometown knew the situation that the demoniac had been in for years, that he was the guy, little, Tommy the tomb dweller, and everybody knew that, right? That he was the guy that lived out in the cemetery and he was walking around naked. Everybody was scared of him, and now Jesus has changed his life. Nobody else in all the other towns are going to know that. He says, you stay in your hometown. This is where you can do the most good. You stay here, but you let them know what Jesus has done for you. Text says this. He says, return to your own house and tell what great things God has done for you. And he went his way and he proclaimed throughout the whole city what great things Jesus had done for him. Sometimes there's situations where maybe we need to get out of town. Jesus said a prophet is not without honor except in his own country. He didn't feel like he could do a whole lot of good in his hometown. But there's other people, you can do a lot of good in your hometown when people know and hear that testimony of how Jesus has changed your life. When Jesus transforms your life completely, it is natural to want to serve him and proclaim him out of a heart of thankfulness for his gifts. Take a look at 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2, where Peter, who's writing to people who were once in sin, who have been freed from their sin, who'd been offered forgiveness, he's encouraging them to endure, and he tells them, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Peter says one of your jobs as a Christian, one of your most basic jobs is to let people know that you once walked in darkness and lived in darkness, but Jesus changed your life and you now walk in light. You once were not a person who received the mercy of God, but now you receive the mercy of God, and therefore you are part of a special people. And so our response to the power of Jesus should be a response of desiring to serve him, wanting to talk about him. Do you want to talk about Jesus with other people? If he saved you, and if he's changed you, and if he's transformed you, you should want to talk to other people about that and tell other people what Jesus can do for them. After the healing of the woman with the flow of blood, notice the response to Jesus. She comes in verse 47. You skip on down to verse 47. She comes trembling, it says, falling down before him. You see how there's this common response. And she declared to him in the presence of all the people the reason she had touched him. Do you notice what she's willing to do when faced with Jesus? This Jesus who she just touched and was healed, this Jesus is asking a question: who touched me? Now, Peter thinks that's kind of a crazy question. I kind of like Peter's response. Like, Peter's like, we're in a big crowd, Jesus. What in the world do you think? Everybody's touching you. Everybody's pressing up on you. Everybody's out here. Jesus says, no, I felt power come out of me. Someone touched me and someone has been healed. And this woman realizes she's about to get outed. And because she's just been healed by someone who supernaturally has healed her, he probably has the ability to supernaturally know who's touched him. And so she goes ahead and confesses her sin. I think there's something simple about that we can learn too. When the power of Jesus accomplished what no human could not, this woman fears Jesus, first of all, and she's willing to confess her uninvited touch to the one who'd healed her. When we realize how worthy Christ is, how powerful Christ is, then we will be filled with godly fear, leading us to realize our own unworthiness in the presence of the Holy One. I love the scene that's shared with us in Revelation chapter 4. In Revelation chapter 4. Revelation chapter 4, there's this verse that talks about how when we're all gathered around the throne, verse 4 says this, around the throne there's going to be 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their heads. And you think to yourself, oh wow, these must be very good people. These people are people who are sitting around the throne of God, and they've even been crowned. We read that verse sometimes, right? Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10, it says, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. And we talk about, that's awesome. We're going to get a crown someday. But do you see what they do with their crowns? When they finally get into the presence of Jesus, verse 10 says, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. And they cast their crowns before the throne, saying, you are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. We don't deserve a crown. You're the only one that deserves being honored. And they say we're not worthy. This woman realizes she wasn't worthy of the blessing of Jesus. She is scared and trembling in the presence of Jesus, willing to confess, I'm the one who touched you. Her comment reminds me of Peter in another text that we read in Luke chapter 5 and verse 8. After the haul of fish in Luke chapter 5, Peter says, woe, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. I don't even deserve to be in your presence. And so there should be a sense of godly fear, and that godly fear should lead us also to confess whatever it is that we've done wrong that causes us to be unholy in the sight of the one who is holy. Perhaps the reason why we're not willing to confess our sins, whether through private prayer or even here publicly in front of other people, is a sense of pride, stubborn pride. And perhaps sometimes a lack of understanding of how holy and awesome God is. Everything is naked and open before him. This woman understands that, and she confesses quickly and openly. Now, two more things that I want you to note as we think about how we should respond to Jesus, realizing all that he can do, and that is the ruler's daughter. After she's healed, simply, the text says this, that her parents were astonished. Astonished. And they were astonished because Jesus has done something that they've never seen any ordinary person do. And I think there's a simple lesson for us. Don't you dare put Jesus on a par with any other ordinary man. His miraculous works are simply too astonishing for us to treat him in a casual and cavalier manner. When we realize the uniqueness and power of Jesus, then we want to trust him and we will want to surrender to him. But as we finish out this idea, did you know that not every witness of Jesus reacted in a way that you might expect? When we talk about Jesus, we're talking about one who could still the storms. We're talking about one who could cast out demons, who had power over the spirit world. We're talking about one who could heal diseases that had plagued people for years, where they had drained entire bank accounts. We're talking about one who could face death and just in 3 quick words, little child arise, could raise a child from the dead. When I think of a Jesus like that, I think this is someone who deserves my honor, my respect, my obedience, my trust. I need to give him my everything because in his hands are the power to help, to heal, and ultimately the right to judge eternally. And yet some people, after knowing those things, still don't respond in humble obedience to Jesus. Not every witness reacts in a way that you might expect. When we look at Luke chapter 8 and verse 37, the witnesses of the transformed demoniac saw what Jesus had done. And the text says this, the whole multitude of the surrounding region of the Gadarenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. And he got into the boat and he returned. They say, Jesus, leave. We don't want you here. You need to get out of our country. We're scared of you. Now, that may seem strange to think that these countrymen wanted Jesus to go. I would think, oh, hey, guys, did you know Jesus is in town? Let's set up a little, revival this week. Let's have a gospel meeting this week. Let's kind of have a little campaign here. Let's invite Jesus to stay for a while because maybe he could help a lot of other people. But these people say, Jesus is in town. We don't want him in town. We'd want him to go. But I want you to think of what Jesus just done. Jesus has just cast out the demons into the pigs, and the pigs died running off of a cliff. What does that cause for the farmers who are pig farmers? Pretty major loss in profit, right? Lost money. Even though they were raising these unclean animals. Did you know that some people are really impressed with Jesus until they realize that if they're going to live for Jesus, they're going to have to make some sacrifices? Some people are pretty impressed with Jesus until they realize that it's going to affect their pocketbooks a little bit, their bank accounts. You look at examples like Acts 16. Paul and Silas, they're there, and there's this fortune-telling little slave girl, and her owners had made a lot of money off of her fortune-telling schemes. They cast a demon out of her, and they realize, oh, great, now we've lost our fortune teller, we've lost our money. And they are mad at Paul and Silas, and they get them locked up. They didn't care about the girl. They cared about their money. In Acts chapter 19, you read about Ephesus. And these people had been converting to Christ. They'd been leaving the false gods. They'd found true hope in Jesus Christ. But the people in Ephesus had made a lot of money off of Diana, the Greek goddess. They made a lot of money off of making little shrines and little figurines of Diana and selling those figurines. This was their income. And when Jesus comes and they realize they've got to leave idolatry to serve the true Jesus, they say, we need to get this Paul guy out of town. We're going to lose money on this. Some people are willing to follow Jesus unless it's going to cost them money, unless it means real change. And when it means real change, and when it means real repentance, when they realize there's things that they have to give up, they might even have to leave a certain crowd. They're not willing to serve Jesus anymore. They want Jesus out. We don't want Jesus in our life. So are you the type of person who is impressed by the teachings of Jesus, but unwilling to make any sacrifice or to deny yourself for his sake? Because really, when you look at all these reactions of Jesus, all of us fit into one of these boats. Either we turn to him with fear, with godly fear and obedience and surrender and awe and worship, or we reject him and we say, we want Jesus out of our lives. So which one are you? His power is greater than our problems. What problem is it that you're encountering as you walk through this life? I want to encourage you not to panic. Whether it's sin, whether it's disease, even if it's death, there is no problem that is too great for the Lord. That's what we learn from this text. He promises to walk with us through the storms, to calm us through our trials. He can mold and transform us. Though we have long suffered, he can change and he can cheer us. Even when facing death, his life-giving power can assure and can comfort us. And because of who Jesus is, our response should be one of awe and worship, of service and proclamation, of godly fear and humble confession, of complete trust and total surrender in the presence of the Son of God. But he calls you to quit trusting and quit living for yourself. Sacrifice everything for him in complete self-denial, trusting him to lead and to deliver you through this life. These encounters are recorded so that we can step forward in full assurance of faith in Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So I'd ask you, what's keeping you from surrendering to him today? And let's notice something. When we step forward in faith, it's not that we're trusting in our own power to save. The woman, she reached for the hem of the garment of Jesus. She wasn't trusting in her own power to save. She reached for him because she was trusting in his power to save. If you trust in the power of Jesus, will you not reach for him and access that power in the way in which he's called us today?